Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Alumni Insights webinar featuring Josh Young, alumnus from the School of Education. I'm Sarah Speary, the AVP of Alumni Engagement and your moderator for the program today. I'm pleased to have you join us to learn more about the role of the correctional counselor. Before we jump into the introduction of our presenter, I'd like to take a moment to thank my colleague and alumna Audrey Tierney, Associate Director of Alumni Engagement, for arranging for this program. Audrey will be managing the technical end of this program. Also on the webinar is Danny Lynn Howard, also managing some technical issues on the back end. Throughout the presentation, your microphones will be muted, but you are welcome to submit questions through the chat feature found at the bottom toolbar on your screen. I will ask any pre-submitted questions to those that come through the chat following the full presentation. Now a few words about our presenter. Josh Young is a Telemental Health and Community Outreach Specialist for Advanced Correctional Healthcare, the nation's largest jail healthcare provider. The ability to provide telemental health in correctional facilities during the current pandemic has been critical. Previously, he served as a behavioral health provider for 2 internal medicine offices, as well as the mental health provider for the Woodford County Jail. While obtaining a bachelor's degree in applied psychology from Penn State, Josh interned for a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center, which sparked his interest in pursuing a mental health career in counseling. He subsequently graduated from Duquesne, obtaining a master's in education and community counseling. Josh has over a decade of experience advising, coaching, counseling, and instructing students and patients. He has worked in a correctional facility, elementary school, private practice, psychiatric hospital, substance abuse treatment center, and university settings. His background includes specialties in addiction and substance abuse, anger management, children and adolescents, college counseling, crisis, depression, group work, mental illness, school counseling, and suicide. Josh, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Wow, that makes me sound way more important than I am, but thank you. So yes, I'm Josh. I'm the Telemental Health and Community Outreach Specialist for Advanced Correctional Healthcare. And like Sarah said, we're the largest jail healthcare organization in the country. We provide healthcare services to around 313 jails across the country. So we provide nurses, doctors, mental health professionals, and something called discharge planners, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. And so a piece of my job is the telemental health and the community outreach, but then also another piece of my job is working right within a jail. So I work in a jail in Springfield, Illinois, where we have about 320 people in our jail on average. And so to kind of, it was when I got into the counseling field, I never really thought I'd be working in corrections. And it was daunting and scary thought at first, but as time has gone on, I've grown to really love it. And I'll give you kind of an idea of what we do in that setting and kind of how it's different from traditional counseling. So this won't necessarily be about clinical aspects of counseling. It's going to be more about the day-to-day working in a county jail setting. But when I entered the field of counseling, I had visions of sitting in a big fluffy chair, drinking hot tea and talking to patients on a large, comfortable couch. So today, my reality as a counselor is much different than I would have, but I wouldn't have it any other way. Working as a county jail, in a county jail setting is just a little different. So I hope to give you some insight into this challenging but rewarding work of correctional healthcare. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go through and kind of give you step by step of what it looks like to just even go to the jail and work in the jail and the kind of the patients that you encounter in the jail. So my day starts, I enter through the back side door in the back of the jail. The passcode to get into the jail that way. And then I walk down a big hallway full of detective offices and briefing rooms for sheriffs. Once again, at first that was kind of daunting and like, wow, I'm right here working within a much different setting than I would have ever imagined. So go to the back of the jail, I buzz the back door of the jail, and the crow, they call this person, or the control room operator, comes over the intercom and alerts me that someone will be out to screen me for COVID-19. So supervisor on duty comes out, full gown, face shield, takes my temperature, and asks me screening questions for the day, and gives me a mask for the day as long as I don't have a fever and I haven't been to New York or China recently. So then from there, I enter through 2 steel doors that are controlled by 4 different control room operators, and I take a bank of elevators up to the counseling office that I share with one other counselor. And people ask me all the time if I feel safe, or how in the world I feel safe around criminals. But in reality, I actually feel more safe in this environment than I did in my previous work in primary care. There's constantly a presence of correctional officers everywhere. They help you feel protected. If there is a detainee in the jail, they always pretty much have a correctional officer right by their side. And when I do talk to the patients, it's in a very controlled and safe environment, which is much different than my work previously as a counselor, because you didn't have that safety. If someone wanted to get to you, they would be able to. So you have a whole team of people in this environment that are helpful and make you feel safe. So once I get to my office, I grab a jail-issued radio, so I'm able to quickly communicate with all the correctional staff in the jail, the administration in the jail. And this was kind of different too at the beginning, and kind of shocking because they talk in code, and I was like, how in the world am I going to figure this out? Because it's not typically, they don't talk in full sentences, it's more in numbers, police codes. So 10-4, 10-10, 10-20, 10-21. And it was kind of like, how am I going to communicate if this is how they speak on here? But I've gotten used to that, and it's become pretty convenient. And there are times where I've had to call over the radio because there is a fight in the jail between 2 detainees. And then the correctional officers come and handle that. So that's been a little bit different as well. So then I grab my radio, and from there, then I go to the different control rooms. There's 4 control rooms, and I hand them my schedule of patients, and my schedule of what I will be doing for the day. Next slide, please. And the security staff at the jail typically refer to all the people at the jail as inmates or prisoners, but we are, as the mental health staff and the medical staff, we refer to them as patients. So when I do speak about that today, you will hear me refer to them as patients. So once I give them out all my schedules, then I walk to what they call the visitation area of the jail to meet my patients for individual therapy. So the visitation area is actually technically outside of the jail, but connected to the jail. And there's a big glass partition in between when I do speak to them. So when I walk to the visitation area, I have to radio through my police radio to the different control rooms to open different doors in the jail, and then also to move the elevators. The elevators are, you can't just press buttons on the elevators or press up or down. You have to radio to the control rooms so that they can move the elevators up and down. They're ultimately in control of those elevators. So that then moves me up to the 3rd floor, which is where I go to meet with my patients for individual counseling. For the individual counseling, I meet with patients through glass on a telephone, probably just like you've seen in the movies. They're these old school payphone headsets, look like from 1985. Typically, it takes me 3 or 4 times before I find one that actually works. And so the individual therapy in that time, they typically are between 20, 25 to 35 minutes. It just depends on what's going on with each patient. And within the individual counseling, it's more focused on, okay, what can you do to improve your life right now, even though you're in jail? What steps can you do to make a little bit more progress and have your mind be a little bit clearer? It's not going to be digging into, trauma from the past or digging into these deep-seated issues, because in a county jail, someone could be there today and they're out tomorrow. And I bring up all these traumas from the past that they're not ready to handle, that actually does more damage to the person than it does good. So that's something that in this setting you have to be extremely aware of. There are some situations where there are people who you know that are going to be there for a very long time, and you can maybe dig a little bit deeper into their past, but that's something that we're always aware of and kind of find out, what's appropriate for the patient. But it's typically focused on, okay, you can do these few things in jail to get you feeling a little bit better. And really the most important piece of working with these individuals in this setting is listening to their story, listening to what they have going on, and developing a relationship with them. That's one big issue I've seen several times, is that they don't have that outlet. They don't have someone who understands what they're going through, and that can make a huge difference. And just because they're in jail, that doesn't change. That's just like on the outside counseling world, just listening and being there for them. They're going to appreciate that, and they're going to take some steps forward if you do that for them. So after meeting with 4 to 5 patients in that setting upstairs in the visitation, I go downstairs to the high-risk housing area and I meet with patients down there. So I take the elevators down there. And next slide, please. In this area, this is where the patients who are housed alone for suicide watch, we call mental health watch and medical watch. Basically, they can't be housed in the general population for a number of reasons. And so I start every single day. We meet with those patients and check on them and see how they're doing, probably at least once a day, sometimes more than once a day. Suicide watch typically consists of patients who are at higher risk to attempt to harming themselves. Examples of this are patients who have past attempts of harming oneself, patients detoxing from alcohol, heroin, or other drugs. Detox can be a very high risk time for someone who's in jail, and that is a time when people do attempt to harm themselves, is when they are detoxing from alcohol or heroin, and then they're in jail, and it's overwhelming. Like, what in the world did I do? Why am I here? And then they're not thinking clearly because of the withdrawals from the drugs. So that is the time when people do end up on suicide watch, to make sure that they are safe. Suicide watch patients are provided with only what they call a suicide smock, a suicide blanket, and around 15-minute checks with the CEOs. The suicide smock is a green outfit. It's very coarse, so you can't tie it in a knot to harm yourself. Same thing with the suicide blanket. And then they have 15-minute checks where the CEOs go through the high risk booking area, check on them 24/7 every 15 minutes to make sure that they're doing okay. And then we also have something called mental health watch. Patients usually don't stay on mental health watch very long. The goal is to get them out of the high-risk booking area into our mental health housing unit, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But mental health watch consists of patients who can't be housed with the general population because they're aggressive, or other people in the jail might be aggressive towards them. These individuals typically are experiencing active psychosis due to a mental health condition or withdrawal from a substance, or even experiencing bipolar mania. So during my rounds in the high-risk unit, I talk with patients through the door or through the chuck hole. The chuck hole is where they open that in the door so that they can get their food through there. So oftentimes I will sit on the floor to the side of the chuck hole so they can't punch me or attack me in any way, and talk into the cell that way. And we'll have basically an individual counseling session, or just assessing to make sure that they're not going to harm themselves by sitting on the floor and talking to them through a chuck hole. So that's a big difference too from what you would think of, a typical counseling environment. But it can be very powerful because some of these people are in the darkest places of their life, and it can be very powerful to be able to be there to help them, take steps forward. So in the time that I am checking in with them, I must evaluate the patient's mental status, determine the risk of a possible suicide attempt, and then also determine what's the most appropriate housing unit for them, so that they can be successful, and to figure out when it's safe for them to be transferred from the high risk area to a more appropriate housing unit. So if the patient is no longer at risk of harm to themselves or others, then I complete the paperwork for that, and they are then transferred to the appropriate housing block. Then the patient follows up with mental health, typically weekly for individual therapy, but it all depends on it's kind of a case-by-case basis on how often they're going to see us after that. And that I give my recommendations, and so does the other counselor, for where we think the patient should be placed, but it's ultimately up to the classification team on where the patient is going to go. Because before anything in the jail setting, safety comes first. So I can say I think this patient needs to go here, but classification can come back and say, no, they can't go there because so-and-so is in there and he might hurt him, or there's gang members over there, they can't go there. And so it's ultimately up to them, because safety is the number one concern when it comes to that. But I fill out the paperwork, and they figure out, classification figures it out from there. It's their call at the end. So after work in the high risk area, then I would typically check in with the patients who live what we call them, like our mental health blocks and our segregation blocks. So the mental health blocks are typically people who were in the high risk area because they came in, and we recognized that they had some mental health concerns. And then once we realized they could be safe outside of the high risk area, they go to the mental health, into the two different mental health blocks. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in this area, I talk to the patients through the door of the chuck hall as well. It's kind of same type of deal. Sometimes it turns into an entire individual counseling session. Sometimes it's just checking, assessing, making sure that they're not a harm to themselves at that time, and that they're in the appropriate housing unit. So all the patients in the two mental health blocks deal with significant mental health concerns that do not enable them to live in the general population area. And so patients in this block typically deal with schizophrenia, bipolar, severe PTSD, severe depression, substance addiction, and personality disorders. They get out of their cell 2 hours a day. So two separate times they get an hour out of their cell by themselves. And they can watch TV, take a shower, exercise, talk to the correctional officer who's in there. So they get out 2 hours a day, and the rest of the time they are in their cell. During my visits with them, I evaluate the patient's mental status and determine if they are a threat to harm themselves. I also talk with the security staff to kind of hear what behaviors they have been observing from these patients. And so that's a big, important piece, because the security staff is always there. I'm only there for, an hour here or there. The security staff is there all the time. So they give me a great insight into, what's truly going on with the patient. It's another piece of why teamwork is so important in this setting. For example, there was a patient who was experiencing active psychosis and was smearing feces all over the window. And the security staff alerted me of that, and then we had to handle it from there. But if no one communicates that to us, then that's we could miss something big there. So that's a big piece of it, is communicating with your security staff. And I also check something called the Blue Book to make sure the patient has been eating, drinking, and showering on a regular basis. So in the Blue Book, they keep track of anyone who's housed by themselves, if they eat every meal, if they shower every day, and if they use the phone as well, so that make sure they're having social interaction outside of the jail as well. So eating, drinking, and showering are good ways to help determine the patient's overall mental status. So if a patient is not showering, it should show an increase in depression or an increase in psychosis from the patient. This is a red flag. It becomes more important to find ways to improve and to look at it and figure out how we can improve the patient's mental status from there. And then if they're not eating, that's obviously a big concern as well. So all that's documented in the Blue Book by the security staff. And if a patient's refusing to eat meals or not eating meals, then that's something that we obviously look at. The first step, if they aren't eating missed meals for a day or something, then they will go down to the high risk area, so we can look at them closer and keep a better eye on the patient, kind of maybe see what's going on or why they aren't eating. Is it they don't like the food? Is it they're severely depressed, or is it something else? But if it does it's a case-by-case basis, but if it gets to a point where a patient's not eating or drinking, then they will have to be transferred to the local hospital to get IVs and to kind of get them back on their feet. We kind of evaluate that a case-by-case basis, but we have to be aware, when it does become unsafe for the jail staff to handle it, and then we do have to transfer them to the local hospital. So I also work with the medical team to kind of help them get the patient on the correct medications, kind of tell them what I've seen, tell them what the security staff has seen, so that they can kind of better understand that and then work to get them on appropriate medications. I mean, people who struggle with severe mental illness like schizophrenia, bipolar, that is a very important piece, is making sure they're on the correct medications. Next slide, please. Okay, so kind of the setup of the jail. Each block of the jail houses different kinds of patients. The second floor of the jail consists of female blocks, which makes up about 7% of the jail population. So 93% of the people at the jail are male. Also on the second floor, you have the smaller, what we call work release blocks. It's not really what you think work release is, but it's these blocks are areas, they're just kind of more like dormitory type setting with bunk beds, and people with less severe mental illness, who probably wouldn't mesh too well in the general population. They typically live in the work release blocks. And then we also have trustees who have their own separate work release block. The trustees are allowed to move through the jail during the day, and they're paid to clean the jail and pass out food to the other patients in the jail. So they've built up what they call their points, which means they have a very positive behavior record at the jail, and then they're hired by the county to work in the jail during their time there. Then the third floor of the jail is where the majority of the housing blocks exist. There's A and B block, which we spoke about. Those are the mental health units. They're small blocks with 12 single cells designed for patients with significant mental health challenges. And then we have C, D, F, and G blocks, which are very large housing units, individuals with more violent crimes. And then H, J, and K blocks, large housing units with individuals with lesser violent crimes and a positive behavior record at the jail. It's also called honor dorm. And honor dorm, the patients are allowed to come in and out of their cell all day long. They can be in the day room, which is where the TV and the tables are, or they can be in their cell, napping, resting, but they're able to come in and out throughout the entire day. And C, D, F, and G blocks, once they open the cells for the day, then they have to be in the day room all day long until they get like a break at 2 o'clock from 2 to 4 where they have to go back in their cell. But then besides that, everyone in that area has to be outside in the day room. And then there's L block, or what they call the hole, which this block is the segregation block, where individuals spend time for rule violations. The more significant the rule violation, the larger amount of time spent in the hole. Most of the time, it seems like that is typically fighting that most people end up in the hole. They get in physical altercations with other detainees there, and then they end up in the hole for a period of time. So that is also an area that we check on a regular basis, as well as the counselors. We go in there, same deal as the mental health blocks and the high-risk housing blocks. We go in there, we check with them, make sure they're not at risk to harm themselves, and make sure that they're eating, drinking, showering as well. And a lot of times that's a place where the people who, this is a generalization, but they're people that don't necessarily reach out for counseling. And then once you do have the counselor in there checking on them, talk to them for a little bit, a lot of times I get people then who want to come and talk. And they come and they talk, and they do make a lot of progress. I've seen a lot of success in that. And then they've opened up, and they've never really ever talked to a counselor before. And I think that's been kind of a big deal too. Next slide, please. So why work in correctional healthcare? Why in the world would you want to work in a jail? I get the question quite a bit. For me, this is me personally, there's several reasons. Number one, I mentioned before, is the teamwork. There's many counselors that work in private practices. They're isolated in offices by themselves. Working in a jail, it's all about teamwork. You interact with a wide array of team members on a daily, on a daily basis. Work with nurses, doctors, on the best treatment plans for our patients. I work with correctional officers on the different behaviors that they see from our patients. I work with administration on the best placement in the jail for our patients. So teamwork is a huge piece of it, and you're kind of bouncing around the entire jail. You're always on your feet. You're moving. You are rarely ever bored there, and that's a big piece of why I enjoy it. Next is the clinical challenges. Working in a county jail, you encounter some very challenging clinical presentations on a regular basis. And ultimately, I think this makes you a better counselor, makes you kind of challenge yourself and challenge, what you do as a counselor. And every day you're kind of going, wow, I haven't seen that before. So how do we address this? How do we work on this? What do we do to kind of help this person? And then lastly, it's providing service to one of the most underserved populations there is. There's a lot of these people are homeless. A lot of these people have never really had counseling before, or they barely even had medical care before. And then we're able to step in and help them and really allow them to kind of take some major steps forward. So that, to me, is a big deal. And lastly, for me, as a Christian, Jesus told us to serve the incarcerated, because they are a forgotten people. And so I think that is incredibly important as well for me in that sense too. Next slide, please. So questions.
All right, Josh, I'm here with you for your questions. Mary Kay asked a pre-submitted question. How do you suggest training correctional officers to help give dignity to the inmates?
For us, we use something called mental health first aid. If you don't know what it is, I would suggest Googling it, looking up. It's become extremely popular because it is very powerful, and the basis of it is that you're teaching people how to deal with people in a mental health crisis, but the basis of that is it's not only dealing with the crisis, but the big piece of that is just how you do show dignity to people, how you do show empathy, and how you show that you care for them. So that's something that at our organization we offer to every single jail that we come into, is a training on mental health first aid. So it addresses the mental health crises, but being a counselor in mental health, being someone who can handle mental health well, it is showing dignity, and it is being an empathetic person. So that is what I would suggest for that.
Perfect. And Adrian asked, what type of training is needed to do your job?
Well, I got my master's in counseling from the wonderful Duquesne University. So that obviously is the first step. But then there's also trainings that we've done at the jail on, like PREA, which is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and kind of how you handle if someone does tell you that something's going on and how you have to report that. So that's a big piece of it. Then there's also, we have our typical just kind of how you handle counseling in a jail type training of like what to expect. But it's pretty much the same type of training that any counselor would get. And then you kind of, as you go along, it's kind of dealing with each clinical presentation and taking steps forward with that, and it's learning on the job in that sense. So, and then we also do the mental health first aid training too.
Great, thanks. So Greg asked through the chat a question about confidentiality. And he said you talked a little bit about it in your remarks, but he wanted to see if this was any different than a situation that was outside of a jail with regards to whether legal, ethical, or professional issues, and potentially with relation to direct threats to other persons. With regards to confidentiality, how is that handled differently?
It's handled the same as if it was outside the jail. And I inform the patients of that before we do talk. If they tell me that they're going to harm themselves or they're going to harm someone else, that I do have to tell security that, so that we can make sure that they're safe. So it's pretty much the exact same thing. But besides that, they are, they can talk. And the same thing but if there is sexual abuse too as well, that's something that has to be disclosed as well. So it's pretty much the same inside or outside the jail.
Greg, I hope that answers your question. Feel free to add more in the chat if you have follow-up. We'll move on. Adrienne had another question. She first says, thanks for sharing your experiences related to your work. And she says, what do you love about your work and what do you desire to change about your current work?
I love is the teamwork and the collaborating with the jail staff and being on my feet and being on the go at all times and the clinical challenges of it. What I don't love, I guess when someone's withdrawing from drugs or they're in active psychosis and I come up to the door and they slam their hand on the door or tell me to F off, and it's not because they're bad people in any sense. It's because they're in crisis. And that sometimes shakes me a little bit, but it's something that I guess I've gotten used to over time though too. So, but I wouldn't say I love that piece of it.
So Bridget asked, has your advice as a clinician ever conflicted with prison policy or ideology, and how do you navigate that if so?
Good question. Yes, and it's more just from the standpoint of placement, where I feel like a patient would maybe, they need some socialization. They need to be around people because that's going to maybe help them, start to feel, excuse me, feel a little bit better mentally. But maybe that patient has gotten in multiple fights before and they don't feel safe, placing that patient where I want that patient to go. And might be frustrating to me because I want, what's on my mind is ultimately, okay, how is this patient gonna, be able to succeed and be as mentally healthy as possible? But what's on their mind is the safety of the jail, and that ultimately is number one, because we can't mess with that, because then if that goes, then the entire jail goes, and a lot of people end up getting hurt. So that would probably be my best example of that.
Thank you for that. So Jessica is asking, what about correctional officers' mental health care? Do you do anything for them?
Yes, we do. We offer a program called SEER. And so that's, so we have it's free to any of the people that we work with, any of the jail staff that we work with. And so we have counselors at our organization that can talk to you if you're going through something. It's not necessarily considered counseling, but it's more just a check-in. And then if they do determine that they need further assistance, then we do refer them to a counselor so they can kind of go on a regular basis. But it's correctional officers, typically, just like police officers, they typically do not want to reach out for help. So this is a big way that we can kind of bridge that, is that we work with them by, it's more of just like, okay, hey, you can just talk to us real quick, and if you need anything else, we'll kind of connect you outside. But it's just a way to kind of get the ball rolling and to get them to start talking. And so that can be, and it's almost a crisis in a sense that the police and the correctional officers don't really reach out because they see a lot of things and they deal with a lot of things. And so that's one way that we do help, is through providing that service to them. And also, I mean, even when I'm at the jail, they come talk to me too. They just talk. Definitely not as like a official counseling session, but they just come vent because they see me as a counselor. They see the counselor. Maybe I can say something to him, and that they become more and more, okay with the idea of talking to someone. So we have a program here, but then they also do, when I'm on site, they do talk to me as well.
Awesome. Elizabeth asks if you might tell a story about one of the most powerful experiences you've had in your work in the jail.
One of the most powerful experiences.
Yeah, you may have to think that.
I mean, I guess I don't have a specific one right off the top of my head, because I've seen several times where a patient comes in under the influence of heroin or alcohol, and they're withdrawing from it. And they're maybe having suicidal thoughts because of the whole situation, and they're aggressive and they're kind of all over the place because they're really struggling. And then to see them progress along the way, and then to see them, a couple of weeks later, when they're not on drugs and they're not on alcohol, and to see like how much better of a person they are, and how quickly they take like really big steps towards making improvements when they're sober, that always amazes me. Because you might see someone like that on the streets and think, oh, what's wrong with that person? Why do they act that way? Why are they not a good person? Or whatever thought goes through your head. And it's typically because of the drugs. And then you see them and you start talking to them. And there's so many people that you end up talking to that are really good people that just have an addiction problem. And to see that transformation in a few weeks is amazing.
I'm sure that happens more often than you'd like to see.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Norma asked if you can spell the name of the program for the correctional officers that you use.
It's CIERR.
Great, thank you. Andrea was asking, are there any general suggestions or recommendations for school counselors?
For school counselors.
I'm not sure if it relates to the jail setting.
I feel like across the board in counseling, you can try to drum up as many clinical ideas in your head. You can try to be the most clinically sound person in the world. But in my opinion, you need that, but you also need to set it aside, and you just need to be there for a person, listen, show empathy, ask good questions, and that 90% of people, that's gonna make a big difference. Instead of trying to figure out some incredible clinical tool for them, it's gonna be listening and showing empathy towards their situation, whether it's in a school, a jail, or in a field somewhere. I think that's the biggest piece of being a counselor.
That's good advice. Jessica asked if you are scared to work in the jail because of COVID right now. How has that played into your current situation?
I personally am not, no. I mean, we wear masks. We've not had any cases of COVID in the jail that I work at. I don't think we've had many across the entire, across all of our jails. So we're masked, and I talk to the patients through a big glass window. So I don't really get very close, and there's no way to transfer through that glass window. I'm typically 6 feet apart from all the correctional officers. So I'm really not within 6 feet of anyone right now because of how the jail is set up. So I would say I feel very safe there. It was definitely nerve-wracking at first, but then once you kind of realized how they had it set up, that went away very quickly.
Yeah, it sounds like the jail is perfectly suited for social distancing as far as the staff goes.
Yes, it really is. And as far as talking to patients, it's set up very much so for that. Yeah.
All right, we have another question. Do you do any discharge planning?
Yes, I do. So that's a big piece of what we do too, is not just the counseling, but kind of getting the resources for people that they need for when they leave. Typically, I will help them get set up with a counselor, help them get set up for shelter if they need it, help set up with a psychiatrist, housing, get them on the medical card. So I help with that, but that's not that at the jail, that's not the biggest piece of my job, because then we are blessed that we have the community mental health provider that is actually in our jail as well. So they have a full-time person who does all of that, and what she does is she helps set up all those appointments, a few weeks, a few months before she knows a patient's going to be discharged. Gets all the appointments set up. So they have a list of all the appointments, have a list of, where they're going to go get their medications. And in many situations, she also even takes the patients to their PCP appointment, to their psychiatrist appointment. So I work with her as well. There's a lot of teamwork there to kind of get all those things in line for our patients. So that's a big deal, and we're very blessed that we have that at our jail. And that's kind of part of the project that I'm working on the other side of my job, is to get resources like that in all of our jails eventually someday.
Great. How do you collaborate with medical to ensure medical emergencies are addressed?
We communicate through face-to-face, through email. We kind of let them, anytime there's a situation when I see someone who's complaining of some more of like a physical symptom, then I will let the medical team know right away. But I also, if they're competent to do it, then I also encourage them to put in a request through the communication system in the jail. So we have it on both ends. But especially if there's something really serious going on, I will talk to them immediately, or I will radio them through our radio system to have them come down and talk to check out the patient.
Fantastic. So one of the pre-submitted questions was, do you feel nervous when you release someone from suicide watch?
No. I mean, there's definitely, when I first started, there was some nerves. I wanted to make sure I was seeing everything and make sure that I wasn't missing anything, make sure that the patient's safe. But typically, most situations when they're released from suicide watch, they after spending some time by themselves, they usually improve pretty quickly, because then they're back seeing people, kind of getting back into a regular routine. So overall, I would say no, I do not get nervous. Great.
So I guess I'll end with this final question, unless anybody else submits something through the chat. Your job sounds stressful, and we're all human. So how do you stay calm, or how do you unwind after a long day of counseling?
I go straight to the bar. No, I'm kidding. Typically I exercise. I go for runs. I play basketball. Meditation. If you don't meditate, I highly recommend it. Whether it's through an app on your phone or just sitting in your backyard, staring at the sunset, listening to the birds. Meditation has been incredibly powerful for me as well. So exercise and meditation.
Well, I think that's probably good advice for all of us as we're in a very stressful time kind of across the world. I want to thank you, Josh, for your great presentation and answering everybody's questions. Thank you for continuing the Duquesne mission by serving God through serving others, and for answering all the questions from the group today. Thank you to everyone who participated in today's Alumni Insights. You'll receive a follow-up email, and all participants will receive a copy of the recording of this program for your reference and sharing. If you or an alumnus that you know is interested in presenting an Alumni Insights program, a link to the presenter application will also be in that email. I hope you all have a great day today. Thanks, Josh, and as always, go Dukes. Thanks.